Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Petrichev stated publicly that the exchange will create independent price indicators for grain, forming a more objective assessment of global agricultural value. It was formally acknowledged in the September 2025 BRICS joint media statement and is now on the agenda for the 2026 New Delhi summit under India's BRICS chairmanship. The goal is explicit. The BRICS grain exchange is the latest attempt by the group to dilute the dominance of the dollar-based global trade and financial system. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented, stated, strategic objective confirmed by multiple senior BRICS officials on the record. To understand why the grain exchange is so consequential, you need to understand how the dollar's commodity dominance actually works, because this is the hidden foundation of the entire global reserve currency system. The US dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is not just about oil, it is about commodity pricing architecture. For 75 years, the world's most critical commodities, oil, grain, metals, energy, have been priced, traded, and settled primarily in US dollars. Every country on Earth that needs to import food, fuel, or raw materials first needs to acquire dollars. That structural demand for dollars gives the United States its exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow cheaply, run enormous deficits, and fund its government at lower interest rates than any other nation. Oil was the first domino. The Petrodollar arrangement, struck in 1974, locked energy pricing in dollars for 50 years. Grain was always the second domino, never formally captured but deeply embedded in global trading reality, because U.S. commodity exchanges, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the Chicago Board of Trade, set benchmark prices for wheat, corn, and soybeans in dollars. Every country on Earth buying grain from international markets references a dollar price. China and Russia are now building the architecture to price that second domino in a different currency. They have the production base to make it credible. Russia exported a record 72 million tons of grain in 2024. Supplying nearly a quarter of the global wheat market. Brazil exported $165 billion in agricultural products. Together, BRICS-aligned nations originate close to 40% of all global grain exports. That is enough market share to set a credible alternative price, one that does not require a dollar to execute. This grain exchange is one piece of a three-part commodity dollarization strategy operating simultaneously right now. Piece 1, energy. Russia and China now settle over 90% of their bilateral energy trade in rubles and yuan. Their bilateral trade reached a record 2,448 USD in 2024, growing 26% from 2023. Russian Finance Minister Anton Silanov confirmed that 99.1% of all Russia-China bilateral payments now use national currencies. The dollar has been effectively eliminated from the world's largest bilateral energy trading relationship. India's private refiners are settling Russian crude purchases in yuan and UAE dirhams, bypassing the dollar in one of the world's largest oil import relationships. Iran is charging yuan at the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point for 20% of global oil supply. The petrodollar, the 50-year backbone of U.S. financial dominance, is under simultaneous pressure from the world's largest oil exporter, the world's largest oil importer, and the most critical energy choke point on Earth. Piece 2, payments infrastructure. The payment architecture to execute dollar-free commodity trade at scale now exists and is operational. China's CIPS processes 2,447 trillion annually, growing 43% year-on-year, with 683 institutions in 189 countries. The Enbridge platform has processed $55 billion in dollar-free cross-border central bank settlements. BRICS Pay, linking Russia's SPFS, China's CIAPS, India's UPI, and Brazil's PIX, is in advanced piloting as of late 2025. The new development bank, which now has $42.9 billion in approved loans, is targeting at least 30% settlement in national currencies. On October 31st, 2025, BRICS quietly launched a 100-unit pilot of the unit, a digital trade settlement token backed 40% by gold and 60% by a basket of BRICS national currencies, specifically designed to execute cross-border commodity trade without dollar intermediation. The new development bank president confirmed agreement in principle to use the unit as a settlement currency. Piece 3, gold architecture. BRICS nations collectively control over 12,000 tons of gold reserves. The bloc controls 70% of global rare earth reserves and 40% of global oil production. China's Shanghai Gold Exchange International has been developing a BRICS gold settlement architecture, a system where Russia originally piloted accepting yuan for oil with a blockchain guarantee that yuan could be converted to physical gold in Shanghai. This template has been extended to Saudi Arabia and other partners. Central banks globally bought over 1,000 tons of gold for 3 consecutive years, 2023, 2024, and 2025. Gold reached an all-time high of 4,790 in October 2025 and has continued surging in 2026. Multiple institutional analysts have explicitly cited BRICS de-dollarization as a primary structural driver of gold's extraordinary performance. Here is what makes the grain exchange the most underreported and dangerous piece of this entire strategy. Oil de-dollarization is already public knowledge. The petrodollar erosion has been covered widely, but grain pricing has received almost no attention in mainstream American financial analysis. Grain is arguably more important than oil as a reserve currency anchor because every nation on earth eats. Every government needs to feed its population. Every food importing nation, particularly in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, the countries BRICS is most aggressively courting, must buy grain. If the benchmark price for global grain is set by a BRICS exchange and settled in yuan, rubles, rupees, or the unit rather than dollars, those food importing nations no longer need to accumulate dollars as working reserves for their most essential import. That is the structural dollar demand that disappears, not through drama, not through war, but through a grain exchange priced in alternative currencies that every wheat-dependent country in the Middle East and Africa starts using because it is cheaper, faster, and completely sanction-proof compared to the dollar-denominated alternative. Egypt is already inside BRICS and has stopped trading in dollars for Chinese-linked transactions. Egypt is the world's largest wheat importer, bringing in up to 13 million tons of wheat annually. If Egypt settles its grain purchases through a BRICS exchange and national currencies, the dollar reserves Egypt previously needed for food security simply cease to be required. Multiply that by every food-dependent BRICS partner nation, Algeria, Nigeria, Turkey, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and you have a structural erosion of dollar demand across the entire developing world, compounding every single quarter as the exchange builds transaction volume. BRICS nations control 47.9% of the world's population, 35% of global GDP by purchasing power parity, 70% of rare earth reserves, 40% of global oil, and are now moving toward pricing and settling 44% of global grain production in non-dollar currencies. This is not a fringe geopolitical theory. This is a documented, summit-endorsed, operationally building strategy with a specific 2030 target for full BRICS pay rollout. The grain exchange is formally acknowledged in the 2025 BRICS Foreign Ministers Joint Statement. The unit is already in pilot as a gold-backed settlement token. The foundation is established. BRICS controls 44% of global grain production, 40% of global oil, 70% of rare earth reserves, and 47.9% of the world's population. Russia and China have eliminated the dollar from 99.1% of their bilateral trade. The grain exchange is being built, the payment infrastructure is operational. The unit, a gold-backed digital settlement token, just completed its first 100-unit pilot on October 31st, 2025. Now, the precise timeline of what happens next shows how each milestone directly affects Americans through higher prices, weaker purchasing power, and elevated borrowing costs. The dollar is not being replaced tomorrow. It is not being replaced in 5 years. India's External Affairs Minister S. J. Shankar publicly stated that there is no policy to replace the dollar right now. What BRICS wants is more economic stability, not less. India, as the 2026 BRICS chair, is not an anti-dollar crusader. In February 2026, India broke ranks with BRICS and signed a trade deal with the United States, agreeing to halt Russian oil purchases in exchange for U.S. tariff reductions from 50% to 18%. BRICS is not a unified, disciplined bloc marching toward a single currency. It is a grouping of diverse economies with different inflation histories, capital controls, geopolitical priorities, and often competing national interests. The dollar still dominates. It accounts for approximately 89% of all global currency exchange transactions and represents 56.32% of all foreign exchange reserves globally. The $7.5 trillion daily foreign exchange market, which dwarfs annual goods trade, remains overwhelmingly dollar-denominated. No alternative has the liquidity, legal infrastructure, or institutional trust to replace it overnight. Analysts are clear. BRICS is building regional alternatives, not a global replacement. Here is why it still matters enormously for Americans. The story is not whether the dollar gets replaced. The story is whether structural demand for dollars declines at the margin. And at the margin, the data shows it already is. Now through the end of 2026, BRICS Pay is in advanced piloting. The BRICS Cross-Border Payments Initiative is on the agenda for the 2026 New Delhi Summit. The new development bank is actively executing its target of 30% local currency lending, with $42.9 billion in approved loans, representing roughly $13 billion in non-dollar development finance already in motion. The unit completed a 100-unit pilot. mBridge is processing live transactions at $55 billion in cumulative volume. China-Russia trade is 99.1% dollar-free at 24,480,000 yuan annually. India's private refiners are settling Russian crude in yuan and dirhams, despite the government's official distancing from de-dollarization. In 2027, small-scale BRICS pay pilots across specific trade corridors are expected, connecting Russia's SPFS, China's CIAPS, India's UPI, and Brazil's PIX into a single interoperable network. This is a test of whether four very different national payment systems can communicate reliably. If the pilots succeed, the volume of non-dollar intra-BRICS trade settlement grows measurably. The grain exchange moves from discussion to operational framework development. By 2030, the full BRICS pay rollout target is confirmed by multiple official statements, including Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. If achieved, a payment system